Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Derek, 32, and I used to think that keeping quiet was the mature thing to do. My dad always said that silence kept peace, that family was too sacred to argue with. For most of my life, I believed him. I bit my tongue through insults, through unfair treatment, through years of being the one who should know better. But the day my sister's son smashed the gift I'd been given for my promotion, and then smirked like I was the problem, something inside me cracked in a way that silence couldn't hold anymore. To explain what led to that moment, you'd have to understand my family dynamic. My parents own a small chain of family-run stores, a business my grandfather started decades ago. When I was in my 20s, I became the one keeping it afloat. I managed the finances, streamlined the suppliers, trained employees, and built up the online sales that saved us when things got rough. But despite that, I've always been the help. My sister, Lisa, older by 2 years, has always been the favorite. Dad calls her his little business genius, even though she's never spent more than a few hours a week at the store. She's loud, demanding, and, if I'm being honest, she knows how to twist situations to make herself look like a victim. Our parents never seemed to notice that while Lisa spent weekends traveling or networking, I was covering her share of responsibilities. When I mentioned it once, Mom said, "She just needs time to figure things out. You've always been better with money." I should have known then that better didn't mean appreciated. A few months ago, something finally went right for me. After years of balancing the family business and my own side work, I was promoted to regional operations manager at a major company, something I'd worked toward quietly for years. It felt like freedom. For once, I wasn't depending on the family store or waiting for approval that would never come. When I told my parents the news, I expected at least a little pride. Dad congratulated me with a handshake like I was an employee, not a son. Mom said, "That's wonderful, dear," while asking if I'd still keep an eye on the accounting. Lisa's reaction, though, was what stuck with me. She smiled and said, "Wow, Derek, guess we'll see if the big boss life suits you. Don't get too full of yourself." Then she laughed, but there was something sharp underneath it. Her husband, Todd, joined in. He's the kind of guy who calls himself laid back while living off Lisa's parents' money. He clapped me on the back and said, "Maybe you can finally buy yourself a car that doesn't squeak when you brake." Everyone laughed. I forced a smile. I always do. A week later, my parents decided to throw a small family dinner to celebrate my promotion. I should have known it wouldn't be about celebrating me. It never is. When I arrived, Lisa's kids were running around the house like it was a playground. The youngest, Mason, who's 9, had one of those grins that tells you he's used to never hearing the word no. He's the kind of kid who throws tantrums in restaurants while everyone else apologizes for how tired he's been lately. I greeted him politely, but he barely looked up from his tablet. Dinner was what you'd expect. Lisa talking about her business ideas, which were just half-baked concepts she'd read on social media. Dad reminiscing about when the business used to be about family values, and Mom reminding everyone that we should all help each other. I sat there, smiling, listening, sipping water, waiting for it to be over. Then, after dessert, Dad stood and said, "We actually have a little something for you, son." He walked over with a box. Inside was a beautiful watch, expensive, elegant, something I never would have bought for myself. It wasn't just a gift, it was recognition. For a brief moment, it felt like they finally saw me. I thanked them sincerely. Even Lisa seemed impressed. "Wow, Dad," she said, examining it. "That's nice. Must have set you back a bit." Todd chimed in. "Guess promotions really do pay off, for the whole family." Everyone laughed again. I tried not to let it bother me. The mood shifted when Mason reached for the watch. "I want to see," he said, grabbing it from my hand before I could react. I told him gently, "Careful, buddy, it's fragile." But he didn't listen. He turned it over in his hands like it was a toy, smirking. "This is boring," he said, and before I could stop him, he slammed it against the table edge. The sound was like glass breaking inside me. The strap snapped. The face cracked. The room went silent for half a second before Lisa said, "Oh my gosh, Mason, that was an accident, right?" Mason grinned. "Uncle's just jealous." He's mad because I have cooler stuff. Everyone stared at me. My dad frowned, not at Mason, but at me. Don't make a scene, Derek, he said quietly. He's a child. I looked down at the shattered watch, feeling my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Years of being told to let things go held my tongue hostage. Mom sighed. It's just a material thing, dear. Don't ruin the evening. Lisa put her arm around Mason and said, It's fine. We'll get him something else next time. I stayed silent. Not because I wanted peace, but because I didn't trust what might come out if I spoke. I excused myself early that night, telling them I had work in the morning. Nobody stopped me. That silence didn't go unnoticed. Around midnight, as I was sitting on my couch trying to shake off the anger, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Dad. You're no longer welcome here. That was all it said. A few seconds later, Lisa sent a heart emoji. No words. Just that. I stared at the screen for a long time, not sure whether to laugh or feel sick. After everything I'd done for that business, for them, this was how it ended? Because I didn't smile through their disrespect one more time? I didn't reply. I didn't call. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there in the dark, breathing through the kind of calm that only comes when something inside you finally stops begging to be understood. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened the family business account, one I had full control over as the operations manager. The account that handled all supplier payments, payrolls, and transactions. My name was still on every major authorization because no one ever bothered to update it. They trusted me completely. And as I stared at the numbers, at the years of work I'd poured into keeping them afloat, I made a decision that would change everything. That morning, within hours, everything froze. After that night, things felt like they'd shifted permanently, though my parents and Lisa acted as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I half expected a message of apology, some kind of acknowledgement, anything that hinted they realized how cruel that moment had been. Instead, silence. By the third day, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a line being drawn. I had been erased quietly. The only thing that kept me from spiraling was work. My new job was demanding, and I poured myself into it. The hours were long, but they were mine. No one was calling me in a panic because an invoice was missing or a supplier had delayed an order. No one was guilt-tripping me into spending weekends doing family work. For the first time in my adult life, I had freedom and peace. That peace lasted about 2 weeks. One afternoon, while I was in a meeting, my phone kept lighting up with notifications from the old business chat group. At first, I ignored them, thinking it was routine chatter, until I noticed my name being mentioned repeatedly. During a break, I scrolled through the messages. Lisa had written, "Does anyone know why Derek removed access to some of the supplier folders? He's not even involved anymore." My chest tightened. She was lying. I hadn't touched any folders since leaving. But that wasn't unusual for her. Lisa had always been skilled at planting seeds of doubt. A few minutes later, Dad messaged, "He's probably trying to make a point." Typical. Mom added a heart emoji. It was a small thing, but it reminded me how little they thought of me. They weren't confused or concerned. They were united against me. That night, I opened my email and found something that made my stomach drop. Lisa had contacted one of the store's primary suppliers using my old credentials, pretending to be me. She requested a large shipment of equipment to a new address. Her address. I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to open her own branch, a copy of the family store, under her name only. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. I called Dad immediately, still trying to stay calm. He answered after several rings. "What is it?" he asked, already sounding irritated. "I just saw the supplier email. Lisa's using my login. Do you know about this?" There was a pause. "Of course I do," he said. "We talked about it. She's helping us expand. Using my credentials? You don't work here anymore, Derek," he said, as if I had quit voluntarily. "You made your choice. Lisa's picking up where you left off." "She's not expanding," I said quietly. "She's taking assets that belong to the business and putting them in her name. That's illegal, Dad." His tone hardened. "Watch yourself. You're lucky we even trusted you as long as we did." That word, trusted, hit me like a slap. For years, I'd been the one they relied on, the one who handled the finances when no one else could balance a spreadsheet. And now they were talking to me like I was the ungrateful one. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. The next few days were chaos. Suppliers called, confused about multiple conflicting orders. Employees reached out asking why their hours were being cut. I discovered that Lisa had told them I mismanaged the company before leaving, that she was now cleaning up the mess I made. And the worst part? My parents believed her. It wasn't long before word spread around town. Our family name had always meant something in the local business circle, and now I was being whispered about as the son who almost ruined the company. I received polite smiles and pitying looks from people who used to respect me. The humiliation burned, but what hurt more was knowing Lisa enjoyed it. A week later, I got a message from her. It said, "Don't take this personally, Derek. You were just holding things back. I'm doing what's best for everyone." I stared at the message for a long time. Holding things back. That was her version of reality. Me doing all the work, her taking the credit. Then came the real blow. My dad called one evening, his voice full of that cold disappointment he reserved only for me. "We've made a decision," he said. "Since you're moving on, it doesn't make sense for you to keep control of the accounts. Lisa will take over as full administrator." I stayed silent for a long time. "You know she doesn't have the experience for that," I finally said. "She'll learn. You're good with numbers, but you've always been selfish. You think about your own success more than the family's." That was the moment something inside me shifted. For years, I had convinced myself that their favoritism was just ignorance, that they didn't see how much they hurt me. But in that moment, I realized it wasn't ignorance. It was choice. They chose Lisa. Every single time. I had spent years fixing their mistakes, managing crises, bailing them out when they couldn't pay the bills. And this was my reward, being cast out like a problem to be erased. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at old financial reports, at the hundreds of hours I'd poured into that business. I thought about every late night I'd spent balancing their books, every time I'd said sure when I wanted to say no. And for what? To be told I was selfish? The next day, I went to the main store to collect a few of my personal items. When I walked in, I noticed something strange. My framed photo, the one of me with the team during the first anniversary of the store's reopening, was gone. In its place was a new one, Lisa, smiling with a pair of scissors at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The plaque beneath it said, "Store Director, Lisa Grant." It was like I'd never existed. Lisa walked out from the office, surprised to see me. She had that smug, perfect composure she always put on when she knew she was winning. "Oh, hey," she said. "I didn't think you'd come by." "I came to get my things," I said. She nodded toward the storage room. "I put your files in a box. I figured you wouldn't want to be reminded of the past." I followed her, trying to ignore the rising anger in my chest. "Why are you doing this, Lisa?" I asked quietly. She turned and smiled. "Doing what? Taking initiative? Dad says someone needs to lead." "You're not leading," I said. "You're stealing." Her expression sharpened. "You always think you're the only one who deserves recognition. You've had your little moment, Derek. But this business is family. It belongs to people who care about it, not people who abandon it." "Abandon?" I repeated. "You kicked me out." She shrugged. "You're too emotional. You never fit in with how Dad runs things." I stared at her for a long moment, and then I noticed something. Her eyes flicking toward the desk, where my father's signature was on a new contract. It was a supplier deal, the kind that would transfer all purchasing power to her branch. I realized then that she hadn't just manipulated them emotionally, she'd cornered them financially too. I took the box and walked out without another word. That evening, my dad called again, saying I was being immature for not congratulating Lisa on her promotion. I almost laughed at the irony. He told me to grow up and stop acting like a victim. Mom chimed in, saying she wished I'd just let things go. I didn't argue. I just listened until they hung up. But as I sat there afterward, surrounded by all the memories of years I couldn't get back, I realized something had broken in me completely. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. I had nothing left to lose. That was the breaking point. The moment I decided I would stop being the quiet one. Because when they sent that text, You're no longer welcome here. They didn't realize that I was the only reason the doors could stay open, and they were about to find out exactly what it felt like when someone they'd taken for granted stopped protecting them. For a while, I thought I'd hit the lowest point of my life. Losing the family business wasn't just a financial blow. It was like losing a part of my identity. I had built so much of who I was around keeping that place alive. Every long night, every crisis I fixed, every dollar I stretched, it had all been in service of a dream that didn't even belong to me anymore. The days after the confrontation were a blur. My phone barely rang, and when it did, it wasn't anyone I wanted to hear from. I stopped checking the business emails entirely. I unfollowed the store's social media accounts after Lisa started posting glossy photos of her new leadership era. She'd even given the brand a subtle name change, just enough to make it seem like her own idea, while still using the old foundation I had built. I stayed quiet, partly because I was exhausted, partly because I didn't trust myself to speak without saying something I couldn't take back. I told myself I'd move on, focus on my new job, and never look back. But the silence in my apartment was suffocating. Then one evening, I got an unexpected knock on my door. It was Mark, one of the employees who'd worked under me for years. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure if showing up was a mistake. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to talk to." I let him in, and he immediately started explaining how things had changed at the store. Lisa had slashed hours, brought in her husband to oversee logistics, and stopped paying certain vendors on time. "She's saying it's because you left everything in a mess," he said, eyes full of guilt. But I know that's not true. I didn't realize how much I'd needed to hear that until the words left his mouth. For the first time since everything fell apart, someone was acknowledging reality. He told me that other employees had left too, ones who had worked there for years. Lisa replaced them with friends of Todd's, people who didn't know how to handle the customers or inventory. The business was starting to crumble, though no one dared tell my parents. When he left that night, I felt something unfamiliar, relief. Not because the business was struggling, but because I wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. Still, I kept my distance. I focused on my new job, putting all my energy into something that couldn't be taken away from me. At first, it felt strange to work for people who actually valued my ideas. My manager, a calm, analytical woman named Fiona, noticed how cautious I was about taking credit. "You don't need to apologize for doing good work," she said once, after I tried to share credit for a project that was clearly mine. "That's literally your job." It sounds simple, but hearing that my competence didn't need to be hidden or minimized, hit me harder than I expected. Over the next few months, I began to rebuild. I saved money, started running again, cooked proper meals. The bitterness started to fade, replaced by something quieter, determination. I even began consulting on the side for small businesses, local shops and startups that reminded me of what ours used to be before greed and ego took over. It started small, with one client who needed help restructuring her inventory system. Then another reached out after hearing about my work. Within a few months, I was consulting regularly. The irony wasn't lost on me, helping others avoid the same pitfalls my family refused to see. But just as I began to feel stable again, the next betrayal came. It was late one Friday night when I got a call from my mother. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Derek," she said softly, like nothing had ever happened. "Can you come by tomorrow? Your father wants to talk." My first instinct was to say no, but a part of me still wanted closure, even if I didn't want reconciliation. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived the next morning, Lisa's car was already in the driveway. The atmosphere was thick the moment I stepped inside. Mom smiled tightly and offered me coffee. Dad sat at the table, flipping through papers. Lisa stood behind him, arms crossed, smirking faintly. "We've had some complications," Dad started. "With the accounts." I said nothing, waiting. "Apparently," he continued, "some of the funds you managed are frozen. We can't access them. The suppliers are demanding immediate payments, and the system says we need your authorization." I looked at him, realizing he had no idea what had happened weeks earlier. "You told me I wasn't part of the business anymore," I said slowly. I removed myself from operations and locked the pending transfers until proper paperwork was filed. That's standard procedure. Lisa's voice cut in sharply. You did that on purpose. No, I said, keeping my tone calm. I did it to protect the company from fraud. Someone was placing unauthorized orders under my name. Her eyes narrowed. You're accusing me? I don't need to accuse anyone. The system logs everything. For a moment, no one spoke. Dad's face turned red. We're a family, Derek, he said finally. You should have talked to us first. You stopped being a family when you threw me out. I replied quietly. Mom looked like she might cry. You're overreacting. You know your father didn't mean that text literally. Lisa scoffed. You're seriously going to play the victim again? You've been trying to sabotage me from the start. That word again, victim. They loved using it. It made everything sound like a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. I stood up, picked up my jacket, and said, You wanted control. You have it now. Dad slammed his hand on the table. Don't you dare walk away again. We need those funds released, Derek. You'll do it, or you'll regret it. I turned to him, feeling a strange calm settle in. No, Dad. You'll regret it. I left before any of them could respond. That encounter broke whatever fragile piece of hope I had left that we could ever mend things. It was also the moment I realized something else. Lisa hadn't actually built anything. She'd inherited control, but not skill. Without me, the business was slowly collapsing under its own weight. And as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me still cared. I didn't want to see my grandfather's legacy destroyed because of their arrogance. So, I started planning, not for revenge, but for independence. I knew every supplier, every client, every vendor that had ever worked with our company. Many of them had reached out privately after I left, asking where I'd gone. Some even said, Things aren't the same without you. It sparked an idea. If Lisa could rebuild something on my foundation, I could build something on what I had created. Something better. Over the next few months, I quietly launched my own consulting agency, expanding the work I'd started on the side. It began as a small operation, just me, my laptop, and a few loyal clients. But it grew fast. Word spread that I was reliable, efficient, and fair. Soon I had more work than I could handle alone. By the end of the year, I hired 2 assistants and registered the business officially. I named it True North Consulting. The name meant something to me. It was a reminder of direction, of staying steady even when everything else spun out of control. Financially, I was doing better than ever. Emotionally, I was lighter. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't still check on the family business from time to time. Every time I drove past the storefront, the parking lot seemed emptier. The lights went off earlier. I even heard whispers that Lisa had taken out loans to expand again, though I knew she didn't have the cash flow for it. It was like watching a storm gather in slow motion, inevitable, but you couldn't look away. Then, one evening, I got another message. This time from Mark. He wrote, You might want to check the business registry. Something's happening. I clicked the link he sent me. My jaw tightened. Lisa and my father had restructured the business, again. This time, they had registered it as a new entity, with Todd listed as co-owner. In doing so, they had violated several contracts tied to supplier agreements I had negotiated personally. Agreements that included strict non-transfer clauses, which meant, legally, those contracts, and the accounts tied to them, were frozen. They had no idea what they'd just done. For the first time in months, I didn't feel angry or hurt. I just felt ready. Because this time, I wasn't the helpless son trying to earn his family's respect. I was the man they had underestimated again. I spent the next few weeks in near constant planning. I had enough distance from my family now to think clearly, and for the first time, I could see their weaknesses as clearly as I could see my own strengths. Lisa had made a critical mistake. She had overestimated her control and underestimated my knowledge of the business. Every supplier, every employee, every little loophole in contracts and financial agreements was something I knew inside out. I didn't need to act recklessly. I just needed to wait for the perfect moment. The first step was information. I dug through every publicly available record, cross-referencing business licenses, ownership changes, and supplier agreements. Most of it confirmed what I suspected. Lisa and Dad were careless. Todd had no experience managing finances, and several of the contracts they had transferred or signed in their names violated clauses that would freeze shipments or cancel agreements automatically. It was a ticking time bomb, and I was holding the match. At the same time, I quietly reached out to people I knew could be allies. Mark, of course, was my first call. He had worked under me for years and still respected my leadership. "I've got your back," he said when I explained that I wasn't planning to confront them yet. "Just prepare. Whatever you need, numbers, contacts, logistics, I'm in." Then there were the suppliers. Over the years, I had built relationships with them based on trust and reliability. Some of them had already contacted me after Lisa mishandled an order or failed to pay on time. I didn't need to convince them to help. They were eager to see the business back in competent hands, even if just temporarily. A few private conversations later, I had a quiet network ready, suppliers willing to freeze shipments, employees willing to step in, and consultants ready to help me rebuild in a controlled way. I also took care to document everything. Every email, every message, every order that had gone wrong because of Lisa or Todd's incompetence was saved. Every lie or distortion of facts they'd spread about me to suppliers, employees, or even minor clients was logged. It was tedious work, but meticulousness was going to be my advantage. When the time came, I would not just be right, I would have proof. Meanwhile, I continued growing my own consulting business. It was like training in stealth mode. Every project I completed, every new client I signed, gave me not just financial stability, but leverage. My reputation outside the family circle was untouchable. People knew me as the man who could fix problems no one else could. I wasn't just rebuilding myself. I was building a platform from which I could operate freely. I didn't engage with the family in any way. Lisa had started calling the shots at the store, but the cracks were already forming. Suppliers were frustrated, employees were demoralized, and local customers were noticing that the store had changed. Mark sent me updates regularly. Inventory errors, late shipments, lost orders, employee turnover. Every report was another piece of the puzzle I could use. I also studied the company's legal and financial structure with care. I realized that, even though Lisa had control on paper, there were still accounts, vendor contracts, and operational permissions in my name, things they assumed I no longer had access to. And they assumed I wouldn't touch them. That assumption was going to cost them everything. I began drafting a mental timeline. I knew that if I struck too early, I could appear vengeful and petty. Too late, and Lisa might patch the loopholes or reinforce her control. The timing had to be perfect. The plan involved freezing key supplier payments, temporarily shutting down operations without causing irreparable damage, and carefully revealing the truth to all stakeholders. It had to be controlled chaos, enough to wake everyone up without destroying the business completely, because I intended to step in, clean up, and reclaim it on my own terms. But I also realized I needed one more thing, a psychological edge. Lisa thrived on appearing untouchable, always smug, always in control. I had to give her the illusion that she was winning, while I quietly maneuvered everything behind the scenes. Every message she sent me, every taunt or manipulative remark, was noted and stored. I didn't react. I never reacted. That was part of my preparation. People who think they've won often make the worst mistakes, and Lisa was overconfident, far more than I had ever been. Over the next month, I quietly tested the systems. I didn't make any permanent changes yet, but I verified that the supplier contracts could be frozen, that payments could be redirected, that accounts could be locked down if necessary. Each test reassured me that when the time came, I would have complete control. I also gathered intel on my parents. They were predictable. Dad, once a meticulous businessman, had devolved into someone who relied entirely on Lisa's judgments. He deferred to her on every decision, often signing documents without reading them. Mom was passive-aggressive in her own way, inserting herself as a moral arbiter but rarely taking action herself. Together, they were a house of cards, and I had the wind ready. At home, my own life was flourishing. True North Consulting was thriving. I had more clients than I could comfortably manage, employees I trusted implicitly, and a growing sense of confidence I hadn't felt in years. Every successful project reinforced the reality that I didn't need my family to define me. I had the tools, the network, and the knowledge to operate independently. Yet, I wasn't reckless. Every step I took in my personal and professional life was calculated to strengthen my position without giving away my intent. I avoided posting anything about the family business online. I avoided discussing the feud with mutual acquaintances, and I kept all communication strictly factual and professional. If Lisa or Dad noticed my progress, they assumed it was coincidence. That was exactly how I wanted it. The final piece of the setup came unexpectedly. One evening, Mark sent me a message that made my pulse quicken. They're pushing a big expansion. Todd is signing contracts without Lisa even realizing it. They're going to mess up the suppliers completely if nothing stops them. I realized that the opportunity had arrived. Lisa's arrogance and Dad's blind trust in her decisions had created a perfect storm. Every weak point I had identified, every system vulnerability, was now exposed. I could act, and I could do it with precision. I spent the night drafting a detailed map of all actions required, which accounts to freeze, which suppliers to alert, which employees to mobilize, and the exact timing to ensure maximum impact without causing lasting damage to the overall business, because I still wanted to reclaim it. I also wrote scripts for communication, emails, messages, and even talking points for suppliers, so that when the moment came, I could execute without hesitation. The weight of it all was heavy, but not in the way it had been when the watch was smashed or when Dad texted that I was no longer welcome. This was a different feeling, calm, controlled, focused. It was power, and it was finally mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't reacting. I was directing. Every manipulation, every betrayal, every underestimation of me had been cataloged, analyzed, and turned into a weapon. And yet, despite all the planning, despite all the preparation, there was a quiet tension that hung over me. I knew that when the first domino fell, nothing would ever be the same. Lisa would scream, Dad would panic, and Mom would be caught somewhere between disbelief and denial. But I also knew that after the chaos, I would be standing firmly, finally in control. That night, I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the city outside my apartment. For the first time, I didn't feel hurt, or lost, or betrayed. I felt steady. I felt ready. The day I had been preparing for months finally arrived, though I didn't wake up with adrenaline or nervous energy. I woke up with clarity. Years of being overlooked, belittled, and undermined had sharpened me into something I hadn't realized I could be. Methodical, patient, unstoppable. The plan was no longer theoretical. I had the tools, the leverage, and the perfect timing. I started the morning quietly, as I had every day since leaving the family business. A strong cup of coffee, a quick check of True North Consulting's accounts, and a few messages to Mark confirming that he and the loyal employees were in position. Everything was ready. Lisa had made the mistake of believing she was untouchable. She had begun the expansion she didn't understand, signing contracts under Todd's name, ordering massive shipments, and extending credit lines without realizing the non-transfer clauses on many agreements. Dad, as usual, had signed everything blindly. My advantage was that I knew exactly how to exploit the gaps without destroying the business. I wasn't here to burn it down. I was here to reclaim it. First, I contacted the suppliers, the ones who had been loyal to me over the years. I sent polite but firm messages explaining that the recent orders were unauthorized and violated contractual agreements. I emphasized that as the original account holder, I had the right to freeze operations temporarily to prevent breach penalties. The response was immediate. Shipments were halted, payments frozen, and emails flagged to Lisa and Todd. When the first confirmations arrived, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, almost clinical. This wasn't about drama, it was about precision. Next, I notified the key employees still loyal to me, giving them instructions to pause certain operations, secure inventory, and avoid further unauthorized transactions. I didn't need them to confront Lisa directly, just to maintain the pause long enough for the dominoes to fall. Within hours, the chaos began. Lisa, expecting smooth operations, was met with angry suppliers and frozen accounts. Todd, who had been pretending to understand business management, panicked when calls went unanswered, orders canceled, and contracts flagged. Dad, realizing for the first time that his blind trust had backfired, tried to intervene. I didn't answer any calls or texts. Every message they sent was cataloged, every plea for help ignored. By mid-afternoon, the situation escalated. Suppliers refused further shipments. Employees refused to process orders without proper authorization, and clients began calling to question the sudden disruptions. Lisa, in her overconfidence, didn't anticipate the backlash. She tried calling me again, demanding explanations, but I simply replied once. I warned you that I had control of what I created. Consider this a temporary pause until everything can be handled correctly. The words were calm, almost polite, but they carried the weight of authority she had never experienced from me before. At this point, Dad finally realized the scale of what was happening. He came to my office, my safe space, separate from their chaos, and pleaded, "Derek, please, we didn't understand. It's just business. Can't we fix this?" I looked at him and saw the same father I had grown up with, proud, stubborn, but ultimately careless with what mattered most. I felt no need for pity. I handed him the documentation, emails, contracts, and proof of Lisa and Todd's unauthorized actions. "You never saw it because you didn't pay attention," I said quietly. "I gave you every opportunity to stop this. Now, you're watching the consequences unfold. I am giving you the solution, not the chaos." Dad stared at the documents, realization dawning. Mom stood behind him, silent, while Lisa had begun pacing frantically in the background, phone clutched like a lifeline. Then came the final move. I accessed the accounts that they thought were fully under Lisa's control. Using the authority I had retained, I temporarily froze key transactions, redirected critical payments back into protected escrow accounts, and secured all supplier communications. Within hours, their access was effectively nullified. Lisa's scream when she realized her control had vanished was sharp, loud, and unrestrained. Todd's face went pale. Dad muttered under his breath, unable to process the speed at which their authority had evaporated. Mom's usual calm facade crumbled, replaced by shock and fear. I stayed in my chair, calm, composed, the eye of the storm I had orchestrated. "Everything you've done without knowledge or authorization has been paused," I said evenly. "You will need to rebuild operations correctly, or you will continue to lose credibility in business. I am giving you the chance to step back, assess, and learn. But this time, there will be no shortcuts." Lisa's face turned red, half from embarrassment, half from fury. "You can't do this. It's our company." I tilted my head slightly. "It was always my work that kept it alive. You just assumed it would run without oversight. You were wrong." Dad attempted to interject. "Derek, this is extreme. We can fix this." I shook my head. "No, Dad. This is accountability. You ignored warnings. You chose favorites. Now you're seeing what happens when actions have consequences." Mom tried to mediate. "Derek, please, don't make this about revenge." "I'm not seeking revenge," I said firmly. "I'm restoring order. Everything you see here is preventable if handled correctly. I am the only one who consistently handled this company with competence. That is not arrogance, it's fact." The impact hit them fully. Lisa had spent months building a facade of competence, only to see it evaporate in the span of a few hours. Todd's smug confidence was gone. He looked like a child realizing he had been outmaneuvered. Dad's pride had been wounded, but he could not argue with the evidence. Mom's disappointment in all of them, and recognition of my skill, was unmistakable. Over the next few days, I worked quietly to stabilize what they had nearly destroyed. I coordinated with suppliers directly, guided employees back in a proper workflow, and ensured that no contracts were permanently broken. I didn't need credit. I only needed to show them that control required knowledge and integrity. Lisa attempted to undermine me again, sending angry emails, manipulating minor clients, and spreading rumors. Every attempt failed. Every misstep she made was amplified because she had underestimated the person she had tried to outshine. Todd's attempts to assert authority were met with polite refusals from suppliers and staff who remembered exactly who had kept the business afloat. By the end of the week, the accounts were secure, operations were functional, and the family had no choice but to acknowledge that their control had been an illusion. I never gloatingly told them I had orchestrated the freeze. They could figure that out themselves. The look on Lisa's face when she finally admitted her failure in private to Dad was worth months of restraint. Dad, humbled and pale, asked me one evening if I would consider handing the business back. I didn't reply immediately. I knew the answer. I had given them all the opportunity to learn, to act responsibly, and to treat me with respect. They had failed. Instead, I said, the business will continue, but my role is advisory. You will operate under guidance, with no shortcuts, no favoritism, and no ignoring expertise. If you fail again, there will be no second chance. Lisa slumped into the chair, defeated. Todd muttered under his breath. Mom's expression was unreadable, but I could tell she understood. This time, the lesson was final. I left the office that night knowing something had shifted irrevocably. For the first time in my adult life, I had stood firm, taken control, and enforced consequences with calm authority. No screaming, no theatrics, no petty retaliation, just precision, patience, and undeniable proof of competence. Weeks later, the business stabilized fully. Lisa and Todd had been relegated to minor oversight roles. Dad followed my advice diligently, and Mom finally stopped sending passive-aggressive messages about fairness. Suppliers respected me, employees trusted me, and the reputation I had painstakingly built outside the family only strengthened the family business in ways they had never imagined. And for the first time, I didn't feel any bitterness. I had done more than protect myself. I had proven that years of hard work, skill, and integrity could not be erased by favoritism, lies, or arrogance. When I finally sat back at my desk one evening, sipping a coffee in silence, I realized the truth. Sometimes, the only way to restore respect is not to fight with anger, but to wield competence with calm authority. And in that moment, I understood something else entirely. I didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. I didn't need their love, their praise, or their acknowledgement. I had something far more valuable: control, clarity, and the knowledge that no one could ever underestimate me again. I smiled quietly to myself. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The family had learned the hard way what it meant to cross me, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never allow anyone to do it again. I'm Justin, 29, and I've always been the quiet one in my family, the one who stayed out of drama, worked hard, and kept my head down while everyone else fought for attention. My brother, on the other hand, has always been the golden boy. Matthew is 3 years older than me, charming, loud, and manipulative in that way that makes people think he's confident instead of controlling. My dad used to say he'd go places someday, but what Dad never realized was that Matt didn't care about earning anything. He cared about taking it. When Dad passed away last spring, I thought we'd at least have peace while sorting things out. He'd been sick for a while, and I was the one visiting the hospital every day, handling his appointments, managing his meds. Matt showed up twice, once to take a photo for social media, and once to ask Dad for a loan for a new car. When Dad refused, Matt stopped visiting altogether. So when the inheritance came up, I assumed fairness wouldn't even be a question. I was wrong. It started small, like most family disputes do. The will named both of us as beneficiaries, with my share slightly larger because I was the one taking care of him. It wasn't about the money for me. It was about recognition. For once, Dad had seen through Matt's charm. He'd seen who was actually there for him when things got hard. But the moment the lawyer mentioned the distribution, Matt's expression hardened. He laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was sharp, forced, almost mocking. "Guess being Dad's nurse pays off, huh?" he said, leaning back in his chair. I didn't rise to it. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Matt was like trying to explain the ocean to someone who refuses to leave the shore. He'd twist everything until he was the victim and I was the villain. So I just nodded and thanked the lawyer for his time. That, apparently, made things worse. 2 days later, I got a call from my cousin, Hannah. She said Matt had been telling everyone that I manipulated Dad before he died, that I made him change the will when he wasn't in his right mind. According to Matt, I'd pressured Dad, taken advantage of his illness, and stolen what was rightfully his. The worst part? People believed him. At first, I didn't know what to say. My phone blew up with messages from relatives who hadn't talked to me in years, suddenly demanding an explanation. My aunt even called to tell me she was disappointed. I felt humiliated. Every good memory I had of my family seemed to twist in my stomach. But I kept quiet. I didn't defend myself, not yet. Because deep down, I knew Matt. The more attention I gave him, the more fuel he'd have. Still, it hurt. Watching people I grew up with take his side was like reliving every childhood moment when he'd break something and blame me. Back then, Dad would scold us both just to keep the peace. "You boys need to get along," he'd say, never realizing how one-sided it all was. Matt knew exactly how to play that dynamic. He'd learned that if he acted wounded, people would rush to protect him. The weeks after Dad's funeral felt like a blur of cold shoulders and whispers. Family dinners turned into interrogations. When I showed up, conversations stopped. I'd walk into the living room and find Matt sitting comfortably in Dad's chair, telling stories about how he tried to warn me not to mess with legal stuff I didn't understand. Every lie he told became more elaborate. He made me sound greedy, heartless, like I'd planned it all. Then came the text. It was late on a Thursday night, and I was sitting in my apartment going through old photos of Dad, trying to remember the sound of his voice, when my phone buzzed. "Matt, you've been cut out." I stared at the message for a minute, confused. "Me? What are you talking about?" "Matt, Dad's estate. You don't get a cent now. Lawyer's revising it. You'll get the call soon. Maybe next time don't steal from family." And then, as if that wasn't enough, he sent another message, a laughing emoji followed by, "Enjoy your little apartment, bro." I didn't reply. I sat there in silence for a while, feeling something inside me shift. Not anger, at least not the kind that makes you yell, but something heavier. A quiet, burning clarity. For the first time, I wasn't hurt. I was done. I didn't know what Matt was trying to pull, but I knew one thing. He'd underestimated me. I wasn't the naive little brother he used to manipulate. I'd spent years letting him win just to keep peace in the family. But peace didn't matter anymore. Not after he dragged Dad's memory through the mud and turned my relatives against me. The next morning, I went through Dad's old files. I'd kept everything. The medical records, legal notes, even the drafts of his will that he'd asked me to look over before he finalized it. And as I read through them, something clicked. There were details, clauses, and statements that Matt clearly didn't understand. Things he probably thought he could manipulate, but couldn't. I didn't contact him. I didn't post anything online or call my relatives to explain. Instead, I called Dad's lawyer, Mr. Brandt, and scheduled a meeting. When I walked into his office the following day, I could tell he'd already heard from Matt. He looked up from his papers with that weary expression people get when they've been caught in someone else's drama. "Justin," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I've been getting some interesting calls from your brother." I nodded. I figured. He sighed. "He's claiming your father wasn't in sound mind when he signed the will. He wants to contest it." There it was. The next move. I should have felt nervous, but instead, I felt calm. Almost too calm. I explained to Mr. Brandt that I had all the documentation of Dad's health and mental state leading up to his final signing. The doctor's notes, the evaluation forms, even the recording Dad insisted on making to prove he was of sound mind. The lawyer's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Your father was very thorough," he said. "He knew Matthew would try something." I replied. When I left that office, I knew things were about to get worse before they got better. Matt wouldn't stop until he thought he'd destroyed me. And if that's what he wanted, I'd let him think he was winning, at least for a while. 2 weeks passed without a word from him. Then, out of nowhere, another message came through. "Matt, hope you're ready for court. This is going to be fun." He still thought it was a game. Still laughed at the idea that he could get away with lying, manipulating, and twisting everyone against me. But this time, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. Because what he didn't know was that I wasn't the one about to lose everything. And as I stood outside the courthouse the morning of the hearing, Watching Matt walk up with that same smug grin he'd worn my entire life, I realized something. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside. That was the day his smile would start to fade, and the day I stopped being the quiet one. When the court date was officially set, I thought maybe, just maybe, Matthew would come to his senses. That he'd realize how ridiculous it was to accuse me of manipulating Dad's will, and that this was a mess no one wanted. But that's not how Matt works. If there's attention to be had, he'll drag things out until everyone's watching. And in this case, everyone was. In the days leading up to the hearing, our relatives started calling again. Not to ask how I was doing, of course. They wanted updates on the inheritance scandal. My aunt said she didn't want to take sides, but then added, "You know how your brother gets when he feels cheated, Justin. Maybe you should just give him what he's asking for." That line echoed in my head for hours afterward. Maybe you should just give him what he's asking for. That was the story of my entire childhood. Dad used to do the same thing. Whenever Matt and I fought over something, a toy, a chore, even who got to sit in the front seat, Dad would look at me and say, "Justin, you're the calmer one. Just let your brother have it." And I did. For years, I let him have it all. He got the praise, the attention, the freedom to mess up and be forgiven instantly. I was the responsible one, the one who cleaned up the messes and got called mature for it. But being the mature one doesn't feel noble when it just means you're the family's emotional punching bag. Now, watching that pattern replay itself as an adult felt surreal. The same relatives who used to tell me to keep the peace were now asking me to step aside for the same reason. It didn't matter that I was the one who took care of Dad in his final years. It didn't matter that I had proof of everything. What mattered was that Matt was loud, convincing, and knew exactly which strings to pull. The final straw came 2 days before the court hearing. I was at my cousin Hannah's house. She'd invited me for dinner to clear the air. I appreciated her effort, but I should have known it wasn't really about reconciliation. Halfway through dinner, she started fidgeting, glancing at her phone every few seconds. Then she sighed and said, "I think you should see this." She handed me her phone. It was a screenshot from Facebook. Matt had posted a long, emotional message about losing trust in family and being betrayed by someone who took advantage of a dying man. He didn't name me outright, but he didn't need to. Every line was a knife aimed directly at me. The post had hundreds of reactions, sad emojis, comments like "Stay strong, Matt," and "No one deserves that kind of betrayal." People who hadn't spoken to me in years were now tagging each other under his post, gossiping, pitying him, tearing me apart. The worst part was the photo he'd used, a picture of Dad in the hospital, one that I had taken. I remember that day. Dad had just smiled after finishing a full meal for the first time in weeks. It was a private, intimate moment, and Matt had plastered it online for sympathy. I put the phone down and felt my throat tighten. "He's gone too far," I said quietly. Hannah nodded, guilt flashing across her face. "He asked me to share it too. I didn't. I left before dessert. I couldn't even taste the food anymore." The anger bubbling in my chest wasn't just about the lies. It was about the complete lack of respect for Dad. Matt had turned his memory into a prop. That night, I barely slept. I sat on my balcony with the lights off, replaying every moment in my head. Every time I defended Matt to our parents, every excuse I'd made for him. I thought about the months I spent taking care of Dad while Matt was out posting pictures from bars, pretending his life was perfect. The betrayal didn't hit all at once. It came in waves, each one heavier than the last. The next morning, I went to the cemetery. I hadn't been since the funeral. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe peace, maybe answers. But as I stood there, looking at the headstone, I found myself talking out loud. "Dad, I try to keep the family together," I said. "I really did. But he's tearing it apart, and I don't know how to stop it without becoming like him." The wind picked up, brushing through the grass, and for a moment, I could almost hear Dad's voice saying, "Do what's right, Justin." Those were the last words he ever said to me. Actually, 2 days before he passed, he'd squeezed my hand and whispered, "Do what's right, even if it's hard." That's when I knew what I had to do. The day of the hearing, I got there early. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, watching people file in, relatives, neighbors, even some of Matt's friends. It felt like a show, and we were the main act. Then Matt arrived, late as usual, wearing an expensive suit and that smug grin that made my stomach turn. He walked up, clapped me on the shoulder like we were old pals, and said, "Hope you brought tissues, little brother. You're going to need them when the judge hears what you did." I just looked at him. For once, I didn't flinch or look away. "We'll see," I said calmly. His smirk faltered for half a second before he laughed it off and strutted inside. During the session, I didn't say much. My lawyer, Mr. Brandt, handled most of it. Matt's attorney, a slick guy with a rehearsed tone, started by painting a dramatic picture of me as an opportunistic sibling who took advantage of a dying father. Matt nodded along solemnly, even wiping fake tears at one point. It was almost impressive how convincing he could be. But then came the moment that shifted everything. When it was my turn, Mr. Brandt stood up and handed over a set of files and a USB drive. "Your Honor," he said, "this includes verified documentation from the hospital confirming the testator's sound mental state, as well as a recorded statement he requested we keep on file for situations like this." Matt's head snapped toward him. "What recording?" he hissed. The judge asked to play it. The courtroom went quiet as the video started. There was Dad, sitting in his hospital bed, weak but alert. His voice filled the room. "If anyone ever questions this will," he said, "know that I made it willingly. I'm of sound mind, and I've chosen my allocations based on who was there for me. I love both my sons, but only one of them took care of me when I couldn't take care of myself. This is my final decision." When the video ended, no one spoke. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Matt's face went pale, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his eyes that looked a lot like panic. The judge called for a short recess. As everyone stood up, Matt turned to me with a glare that could have set the whole courthouse on fire. "You set me up," he spat. I shook my head. "No, Matt. You set yourself up." He didn't respond. He just stormed out of the courtroom, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the tile. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. After the recess, his lawyer requested a private discussion. Apparently, Matt wasn't done. He wanted to appeal the authenticity of the recording, claiming it could have been edited. It was a desperate move, but he was too prideful to back down. Over the next week, things got uglier. He started sending me angry messages, calling me a liar, a manipulator, a fake son. Then he began contacting people from Dad's old company, telling them I was trying to erase his legacy. He even showed up at my apartment once, pounding on my door for 10 straight minutes while shouting that I'd stolen his future. That was the moment I realized how far he'd fallen. This wasn't about Dad anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. Matt couldn't stand losing it, not to me. A few days later, I got a message from Hannah. She said Matt had gone to see our aunt and uncle and accidentally mentioned that Dad's house, the one we both grew up in, was being transferred into my name. It wasn't accidental. He knew exactly what he was doing. Within hours, my phone was blowing up again. Accusations, guilt trips, people demanding that I do the right thing and split it evenly. The breaking point came that night. I got home to find a letter slid under my door. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten, messy, and furious. It was from Matt. "You're nothing without me," it said. "You were always the quiet loser, the backup plan. Dad only gave you more because he felt sorry for you. You think this makes you better than me? Just wait. You're not the only one who can talk to lawyers." For the first time, I didn't feel fear or sadness. I felt something colder. Resolve. He'd burned every bridge he had left, and he didn't even realize it yet. That letter, those words, changed everything. For a few weeks after the court hearing, I disappeared. Not literally, but emotionally, mentally. I stopped answering calls, muted family group chats, and avoided social media entirely. I needed space, silence, and distance from the constant noise my brother had created. Every time I thought the chaos was dying down, someone new would reach out to tell me about something Matt said. It was like he was everywhere, determined to keep his version of the story alive. And yet, beneath all that noise, there was quiet clarity settling inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to him. I wasn't trying to explain myself, fix things, or make people see my side. I was exhausted from always being the one who handled it maturely. So I stopped handling it altogether. But when you've spent your whole life being defined by someone else's chaos, the silence afterward feels strange, almost like grief. For weeks, I went through the motions. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. My small apartment felt emptier than usual. Dad's old watch sat on my dresser, still ticking steadily, a constant reminder of the promise I made at his grave, to do what's right, even if it's hard. What was right, though? I wasn't sure anymore. I'd won the moral high ground, maybe even the legal one, but emotionally, I felt wrecked. My own family thought of me as a manipulative thief. The few relatives who didn't pick sides still kept their distance, afraid to get involved. Even Hannah, the only one who'd halfway tried to understand, texted less and less as the drama escalated. I hit my lowest point one night about a month after the hearing. I came home from work to find my mailbox overflowing, mostly legal correspondence and one thick envelope from my brother's attorney. I didn't even open it. I just stood in my kitchen, staring at it on the counter. All I could think was, when does this stop? That night, I ended up on the floor beside my couch, surrounded by Dad's old papers. His handwriting, his notes, his signatures, it all made me realize how much I missed him. Not for the money, not for the will, but for the quiet kind of love he had. The kind that didn't need to be loud or perfect. The kind that grounded me. I sat there until the early hours of the morning, reading one line he'd written years ago in the margins of a notebook. Character isn't built when people believe in you. It's built when no one does. That line changed something in me. I decided I wasn't going to keep reacting to Matt's destruction. I was going to build something instead. Something that didn't need anyone's approval. So I started small. I'd always loved woodworking. It was something Dad taught me when I was a kid. We used to spend weekends fixing furniture in the garage, laughing whenever one of our projects collapsed midway. I hadn't picked up a tool since he died, but one Saturday, I bought a few supplies and decided to make a simple coffee table. Nothing fancy, just something to keep my hands busy. The process was clumsy at first. I mismeasured, sanded too much, and even cracked the first tabletop in half. But it felt good to fail at something that was mine. No one could twist it or take it away. I started spending every free moment in my garage workspace, creating small pieces of furniture and decorations. I didn't plan to sell them. It was just therapy. But one day, my neighbor came by, saw what I was doing, and asked if I could make a custom bookshelf for his office. I almost said no, but something in his tone, genuine interest, not pity, made me say yes. When he paid me afterward, he insisted on paying double, saying, "You've got a real gift, man." That one compliment stuck with me. I opened an online page to showcase my work. I didn't use my full name, just Jam Craftworks. Within a few months, I started getting more requests. A local coffee shop asked me to make tables and stools. A couple of homeowners ordered shelves. By the time 6 months had passed, I was earning more from my woodworking than from my day job. The more I built, the more I healed. The act of turning raw, rough wood into something strong and beautiful mirrored what I was trying to do with myself. I stopped checking social media altogether, and eventually, I deleted my accounts. I no longer needed to see Matt's fake posts about being wronged by family. Of course, that didn't mean he stopped. From what little I heard through Hannah, he'd gone downhill fast. His business, some sketchy investment firm he bragged about for years, was crumbling. Apparently, several clients had filed complaints, and one even threatened legal action. But I didn't gloat. I didn't even react. It was strange. After everything, I just felt detached. The real test came when Dad's house officially transferred into my name. I drove there on a quiet Sunday morning, the neighborhood still half asleep. The front yard looked wild, the grass overgrown, the paint on the porch chipped. I hadn't been inside since the funeral. Unlocking that door felt like unlocking a memory. The air inside smelled faintly of sawdust and old books. Dad's workshop was exactly as he'd left it. Half-finished projects, tools on the bench, an old calendar frozen on a date from the year he got sick. I stood there for a long time, feeling the mix of nostalgia and sadness tighten in my chest. That's when I decided to restore it. Not sell it. Not rent it out. Restore it piece by piece, just like Dad would have wanted. I spent months fixing the place, painting walls, replacing windows, repairing floors. I even turned his workshop into a small studio for my business. Every nail I hammered in, every wall I repainted, felt like reclaiming something Matt had tried to take from me. As word spread about my work, local magazines and interior designers started reaching out. They wanted interviews, collaborations, and commissions. For the first time in my life, people saw me for who I was. Not as Matt's brother, not as the quiet one, but as Justin, the craftsman who built something out of nothing. And slowly, I began to rebuild more than furniture. I started rebuilding my confidence. There were still hard days. Some nights, I'd get home from the workshop and sit on the porch, thinking about Dad. I'd think about how proud he might have been to see what I'd done with the house. Sometimes, I'd even catch myself wanting to tell Matt about it, to show him that I wasn't broken, that I'd moved on. But then I'd remember the letter, the way he'd said, "You're nothing without me." And I'd smile, because I finally knew he was wrong. But rock bottom has a way of testing you twice. Just when you think you're standing tall again, something or someone tries to pull you back under. It was almost a year after the court case when I got another unexpected message. Not from Matt this time, but from his ex-girlfriend, Clara. We'd met a few times years ago. Nice woman, sharp, too good for him. She said she needed to talk, that it was important. I hesitated at first, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a cafe downtown. She looked tired but relieved to see me. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she said, stirring her coffee nervously. "But Matt's been in trouble. Serious trouble. And he's been dragging your name into it again. Apparently, he'd been running out of money and had started using Dad's name and mine to get sympathy loans and favors from people. He'd tell them he was handling family assets or that I'd frozen him out illegally. Clara said she'd found out after one of his business partners called her, trying to confirm if I was really the one keeping the money. I sat back, letting her words sink in. It was unbelievable, but not surprising. He hadn't learned anything. Clara handed me a folder before she left. "He's going to destroy himself," she said softly. "But he'll try to take you down first." When I got home, I opened the folder. It was filled with copies of fake documents, forged emails, and even a few loan agreements with my name falsely attached. My pulse quickened as I realized what this meant. Matt was trying to shift the legal spotlight onto me, to make it look like I was part of his fraudulent schemes. That night, I sat in my workshop for hours, staring at the evidence. The smell of sawdust hung in the air, grounding me. A year ago, something like this would have shattered me. Now, I just felt steady, different, because this time, I wasn't the naive brother hoping he'd change. This time, I had leverage, documentation, connections, and a plan forming quietly, carefully. By the time I realized just how deep Matt's deceit had gone, I knew a direct confrontation wouldn't work. He thrived on chaos. Confrontation, yelling, even the law, it all fed him. To beat him, I needed a different strategy. I needed patience, leverage, and the element of surprise. So I started quietly gathering my resources, treating it almost like a chess game, where each piece had to be in exactly the right place before the first move was made. The first step was documentation. I'd always been organized when it came to Dad's affairs, but now I dug deeper. Every email, letter, and note from Dad that referenced Matt or the inheritance was filed and scanned. Every hospital record, legal correspondence, and financial transaction I could get my hands on was meticulously compiled. I even went through my personal recordings with Dad, timestamps verified, making sure everything was airtight. This wasn't just about winning against Matt legally. It was about creating an unshakable case that left no room for manipulation. Next, I thought about allies. I realized long ago that my family couldn't be trusted. They had already taken sides against me. But business contacts, neighbors, and even some distant relatives who knew Matt's manipulative ways could be valuable. I reached out quietly, letting a few people know that Matt had been fabricating stories, forging documents, and even attempting to scam others by invoking Dad's name. I didn't ask for help openly. I merely planted seeds. The reactions were subtle but telling. A few people looked concerned, one or two even surprised. Most importantly, none of them doubted me. I also began to study Matt's patterns. Over the years, he had a predictable cycle: charm, overconfidence, lies, and then desperation. He couldn't help but escalate when he felt backed into a corner. That meant I could anticipate his next move. I even started keeping a small log of every interaction he had with my relatives, friends, and his business contacts, noting how he tried to spin narratives, exaggerate threats, or manipulate sympathy. It was tedious, but the more I wrote, the clearer the path forward became. Then came the strategic use of his own arrogance against him. Matt was careless with social media and public appearances. He boasted about investments, gifts, and favors, often exaggerating to make it look like he had more than he did. He even casually mentioned legal disputes in passing, sometimes to the wrong people. I began quietly tracking these instances, saving screenshots and recordings. Each one was ammunition I could use at the perfect moment. While I was building my arsenal, I also worked on myself. I spent hours in the workshop not just creating furniture, but creating an identity and presence that could hold up under scrutiny. My reputation, my work, my network, they became a silent power I could wield. I realized that revenge didn't need to be loud or immediate. It needed precision, like slowly tightening a noose rather than swinging a hammer. One day, I learned that Matt was planning a new venture. This time some kind of online investment scheme that he claimed would finally surpass Dad's legacy. He had already begun pitching it to family friends, claiming I had no right to interfere and that my aggressive claims were keeping him from success. The irony was delicious. He didn't realize that this new scheme, because of the lies he had told, would eventually expose him. But I needed more. I needed him to dig his own grave completely before stepping in. I also reached out to Clara again, carefully. She had insight into Matt's personal life that was invaluable. She confirmed that he had maxed out multiple credit lines under fake names, manipulated friends for money, and even fabricated professional credentials to lure investors. Clara agreed to act as a discreet source if needed, but we both knew she wouldn't participate unless it was airtight. Meanwhile, I watched Matt self-destruct socially. He made public statements implying that I had cheated him out of Dad's estate, but his exaggerated claims were contradictory and easily verifiable. Every overstep, every exaggeration, every fake story he told became a thread I could later pull to unravel him. I started documenting those inconsistencies meticulously, labeling them by date, platform, and source. My plan wasn't just to prove my innocence. It was to expose him for exactly what he was. But the most crucial step came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I received an anonymous tip, an email from someone claiming to have worked briefly with Matt on a business deal. They included attachments, contracts Matt had signed without authorization, evidence of fraud, and a note saying, "You might want to use this carefully. He won't stop." My first instinct was skepticism. But after cross-checking the documents and confirming their authenticity, my heart rate spiked. I realized I now had not only a legal case, but a moral and professional arsenal that could completely dismantle him if deployed correctly. I spent days strategizing. Timing would be everything. I couldn't just release the information to the public or call him out directly. That would alert him, and he was cunning enough to try and spin it or escape. Instead, I began building indirect pressure, quietly informing investors and contacts about potential discrepancies in his documents, framing everything as professional caution rather than personal vendetta. I wanted Matt to feel the walls closing in before he ever suspected me of pulling the strings. I also prepared my own side. I reinforced my online presence with updates on my business, legitimate media inquiries, and careful documentation of everything I'd accomplished since Dad passed. This wasn't just a shield, it was proof of my credibility and independence. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, no one could credibly question my position. Meanwhile, Matt's arrogance worked in my favor. Every time I heard about a new brag or claim he made, I quietly cross-checked it against public records, witnesses, and my growing library of documents. Every lie, exaggeration, and fabrication added fuel to the trap I was carefully setting. He was digging deeper into his own pit without realizing it. Then there was the perfect opportunity. A local charity auction, something Matt had volunteered to organize under Dad's name. He bragged about this to everyone, saying, "I'm making Dad proud." Justin wouldn't know how to handle it. I realized instantly, the event was his weakness. He would be in public, surrounded by witnesses, talking about Dad, manipulating the truth, and I could use it to stage the first exposure of his web of lies without appearing vindictive. I started coordinating behind the scenes, contacting a few key individuals involved in the auction quietly. I didn't reveal my intentions, only that there were discrepancies in the financial statements and contracts associated with Matt's planning. I planted the seeds, ensuring that when the event took place, he would have no choice but to confront scrutiny directly. While doing this, I maintained my calm exterior. I smiled. I continued my work. I grew my business quietly. Most importantly, I didn't let Matt know I was preparing at all. He was still sending me smug texts, laughing at the idea that he had cornered me. The truth was, he had no idea that the person he thought was weak, silent, and powerless had become something completely different, meticulous, patient, and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The final piece of my setup was psychological. I started interacting subtly with mutual contacts, dropping comments that highlighted my credibility without directly attacking Matt. I just hope whoever's organizing these things actually double-checks the contracts, I'd say to investors or neighbors. Small, casual statements that planted doubt in the minds of people who had previously supported him blindly. Over time, those doubts would grow, and the foundation of trust he relied on would start to crumble. By the time the charity auction arrived, everything was in place. Every document was verified, every contact aware, every thread of suspicion quietly woven. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't desperate. I was waiting for the moment when Matt, in all his arrogance, would finally overplay his hand. The day of the charity auction arrived with a strange calm in the air. Matt had been boasting for weeks about how everything was under control and how the event would finally show everyone who's really running this family. He strutted into the venue like he owned it, shaking hands, posing for photos, and announcing loudly that all proceeds would benefit a local hospital Dad had supported. From the outside, he looked untouchable, confident, charming, smug. But inside, I could see the cracks forming, invisible to anyone who didn't know him like I did. I arrived quietly, not to confront him, not to gloat, but to watch it unfold. My appearance was casual, jeans, a button-up, and a calm demeanor. Nobody suspected me. My presence alone didn't raise eyebrows. After all, I'd been quietly rebuilding my life, and I hadn't shown interest in public family events for months. Matt's focus was entirely on the crowd, the applause, and the attention, oblivious that I had quietly positioned myself to trigger the avalanche he wouldn't survive. The first part of the plan unfolded during the initial check-in for donors and sponsors. I'd coordinated with a few key people, board members of the hospital, investors, and a few influential neighbors, who had all received copies of the falsified documents Matt had been using. I had framed it as a need for verification and due diligence, leaving Matt out of the loop entirely. As he went on stage, microphone in hand, declaring the event a tribute to Dad and the family legacy, I noticed his expression changed slightly when one of the sponsors approached him with a folder. She spoke softly at first, then louder as he seemed confused. "These contracts, some of these numbers don't match the records we have. We need clarification before we proceed." Matt's confident smirk faltered ever so slightly. "What do you mean? Everything is correct. I organized all of this personally." "Sir," she said calmly, "there are discrepancies here. Some of these signatures aren't consistent, and a few of these funds, they don't align with the statements we received." The room went quiet. Not painfully quiet, but the subtle kind of silence that presses against your chest. Matt's face turned pale, and I watched as he tried to improvise, stumbling over excuses, blaming assistants, misreading numbers, insisting he hadn't seen any errors. Each word he said only dug the hole deeper. I stayed in the back, watching, letting the truth speak for itself. This wasn't about attacking him verbally. It was about letting his arrogance collapse under the weight of evidence. And collapse it did. Within minutes, a few board members exchanged glances, murmuring about irregularities, while sponsors began pulling out checks and asking for explanations. Then came the emails and phone calls I'd set in motion earlier in the week. Each one had been discreetly drafted and scheduled to hit key investors and business partners simultaneously. They highlighted potential fraud in Matt's ventures, referencing the very same documents I had collected, phrased as professional concern rather than personal vendetta. By the time Matt realized what was happening, the room had shifted from admiration to suspicion. People were whispering, taking notes, and asking for independent verification. He tried to regain control, barking orders, insisting everyone stay calm, but every step he took only made matters worse. I noticed the subtle way his supporters began avoiding eye contact, how some murmured quietly with their neighbors, doubt creeping in. The network he had relied on for credibility was crumbling, thread by thread, in plain sight. By mid-afternoon, Matt was visibly sweating, his voice rising into panic as he attempted to justify the discrepancies. "This is a misunderstanding," he shouted, glaring at anyone who questioned him. "I've handled everything perfectly. I'm telling you, it's all legitimate." The sponsors and investors weren't listening. They were flipping through contracts, highlighting signatures, comparing dates, and documenting inconsistencies. One of the board members, a retired lawyer with decades of experience, spoke up. "Mr. Matthew, these documents are inconsistent with the originals. We need to freeze all transactions until this is clarified. Any further misrepresentation could have legal consequences." That was the exact moment the room changed completely. You could feel the energy shift from confusion to disbelief to outright scrutiny. Every confident gesture Matt made now seemed desperate, frantic, and hollow. He had built his entire image on charm and audacity, but charm doesn't survive evidence. Audacity doesn't survive exposure. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The dominoes fell on their own. Within the hour, several donors requested refunds. A few sponsors quietly left, shaking their heads. News had been discreetly tipped to local business contacts, and within moments, word was spreading that Matt's operations were under investigation. It wasn't public yet, but the whispers were enough to infect his reputation completely. Finally, when the room had emptied of anyone who mattered, Matt stood alone at the podium, fumbling with papers, muttering under his breath, pale and disoriented. I approached him calmly, almost silently, like a shadow moving in daylight. He looked up at me with panic in his eyes, realizing for the first time that I had orchestrated everything perfectly. "Justin," he began, voice trembling. He was trying to figure out what I had done, how I knew, how I had stayed so quiet while watching him self-destruct. I smiled softly, letting him stew in that moment. "Matt," I said, voice even and controlled, "you were always the one who wanted attention, who thought you were untouchable. I didn't do anything. You did this to yourself." His face twisted, a mix of anger and disbelief. You've been behind this?" I shook my head. "No, I've been patient. You made the choices. You lied, manipulated, and burned every bridge. I just waited." He stammered, looking around the empty hall, realizing the scale of the collapse. Investors were gone, sponsors had withdrawn, and the board was discussing legal repercussions. It was clear that not only had Matt's reputation been irreparably damaged, but there was also a very real chance of legal consequences stemming from the fraudulent contracts and mismanaged funds. Then I turned, walking toward the door, my footsteps calm, steady. I glanced back one last time. He was frozen, staring at the folders and papers that documented his downfall. In that moment, I didn't feel satisfaction in cruelty or revenge. I felt the quiet justice of patience, preparation, and letting the truth do the work. Outside, the sun was setting, warm and calm, a sharp contrast to the chaos I had just watched unfold. I pulled out my phone, checking messages from clients, neighbors, and media contacts. Everything I had worked for, my business, my reputation, my independence, remained intact. Stronger, even, now that the shadow of Matt's interference had faded. I sent a final message to Clara, thanking her quietly for her guidance and confirming that Matt's network had been exposed, his lies unraveling. Then I called Hannah. "It's done," I said softly. She let out a long, relieved sigh. Finally, she whispered. Finally. That night, I went home to Dad's house, sitting in his old workshop. The tools, the projects, the smell of sawdust and polish, it all felt like home. I ran my hands over the workbench, remembering every lesson, every laugh, every quiet moment we had shared. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe. I hadn't just defended what was mine. I had reclaimed my life, my identity, and my sense of self-worth. Matt's reign of manipulation, entitlement, and arrogance had ended, not with a fight, but with strategy, patience, and calm execution. I looked at the empty chair in the workshop, at the sunlight streaming through the windows, and whispered to myself, almost reverently, I did what's right, Dad. Even when it was hard. Outside, the world was quiet, the air still. Inside, I felt the weight lift, the burden of years of unfairness dissolve, replaced with clarity, peace, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud, it's inevitable. And with that, I finally smiled, not in triumph over him, but in victory over the years of doubt, frustration, and restraint I had endured. The chapter of lies, manipulation, and betrayal was over, and I was free.